Captain Sarah Chun's hands trembled as she gripped the yoke of the C-130 Hercules, the massive transport aircraft bucking violently through the mountain winds like an angry bronco. Ice crystals formed spider webs across the windscreen as she fought to maintain altitude, her knuckles white beneath her flight gloves. The radio crackled with static and desperation. "Phoenix 1, this is Mountain Rescue Base. We have 37 souls trapped on the north face of K2. Weather window closing in 6 hours. You are our only option. Repeat, our only option." Sarah's stomach lurched, and not from the turbulence. Through the cockpit windows, she could see the jagged peaks of the Karakoram Range, piercing the storm clouds like the fangs of some primordial beast. Each mountain seemed to mock her, whispering the same words she'd heard throughout her career. "You don't belong here. You're not strong enough. You'll fail them all." "Copy that, Mountain Rescue," she managed, her voice steadier than her hands. "Phoenix 1 inbound to your coordinates." Her co-pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez, shot her a sideways glance. "Sarah, those winds are gusting to 70 knots. The ceiling is dropping by the minute. Maybe we should know." The word came out sharper than she intended. Sarah had spent 12 years hearing, "Maybe we should reconsider," every time a mission pushed beyond the comfortable margins of safe flying. Every time someone needed her to be more than the nervous pilot who second-guessed every decision, who checked her instruments obsessively, who carried the weight of every life in her cargo bay like stones in her chest. But tonight was different. Tonight, 37 people climbers, guides, researchers were huddled in emergency shelters, on a mountain face that would kill them before dawn if she didn't reach them first. Their oxygen was running low. The storm was intensifying. Hypothermia was already claiming the weakest among them, and she was the only pilot crazy enough to attempt a rescue at 24,000 feet, in conditions that would ground any sane aviator. That the irony wasn't lost on her. Sarah Chun, the pilot who double-checked every pre-flight inspection, who ran worst-case scenarios through her head until she couldn't sleep, who carried backup plans for her backup plans. She was about to attempt the most dangerous rescue mission in high-altitude aviation history. The same nervous energy that made her colleagues question her confidence might be the only thing that would save those people tonight. "Phoenix 1, be advised," the radio crackled again. "We're reading wind shear between 23,000 and 25,000 feet. Multiple aircraft have turned back. Pakistani Air Force is grounded. Even the mountain rescue helicopters can't get airborne." Sarah felt the familiar flutter in her chest, the racing heartbeat that had earned her the nickname Nervous Nellie among the other pilots at Ramstein Air Base. But beneath the anxiety, something else stirred, a cold, determined fury that had been building for years. Every snicker when she triple-checked her fuel calculations. Every eye roll when she insisted on additional safety briefings. Every time someone suggested she might be better suited for transport runs than combat missions. "Rodriguez," she said, her voice cutting through the engine noise, "I need you to calculate our approach vector for a near-vertical descent. We're going to drop into that valley like we're landing on an aircraft carrier in a typhoon." Her co-pilot's eyes widened. "Sarah, that's impossible?" "Insane? Exactly what everyone expects the nervous pilot to be too scared to try." She adjusted their heading, angling toward the coordinates where 37 people were running out of time and hope. "Maybe, but I've been preparing for impossible my entire career. I've studied every accident report, memorized every emergency procedure, planned for every failure scenario they teach and dozens they don't." The mountain peaks loomed larger through the windscreen, their snow-covered faces gleaming dully in the storm-filtered moonlight. Sarah could feel the weight of the rescue equipment in the cargo bay behind her medical supplies, cold weather gear, emergency rations, and most importantly, the specialized high-altitude rescue pods that could extract injured climbers from terrain no helicopter could reach. "Phoenix 1, this is Colonel Harrison, Mission Commander. I'm ordering you to abort. Conditions are beyond operational limits. Sarah's finger hovered over the radio transmit button. Colonel Harrison had been one of her harshest critics during flight school, the man who'd written in her evaluation that she lacks the decisive confidence necessary for critical mission leadership. He'd probably been hoping someone else would volunteer for this flight, someone with a reputation for nerves of steel instead of nerves that showed. But sometimes nerves weren't a weakness. Sometimes they were what kept you alive long enough to save others. Negative mountain rescue. Phoenix 1 proceeding to target coordinates. Those people don't have time for us to wait for better weather. She clicked off the radio and looked at Rodriguez, whose face had gone pale beneath his oxygen mask. Marcus, I need you to trust me. I know how this looks. I know what everyone thinks about the pilot who checks everything twice and plans for every contingency. But right now, all that preparation is the only thing standing between those people and a mountain that wants to kill them. The aircraft shuddered as they hit another pocket of turbulence, and Sarah felt her pulse quicken. But her hands were steady now, her mind clear. She'd flown this approach 100 times in her head, anticipated every wind shear, calculated every angle of descent. The nervousness was still there, would always be there, but it had transformed into something sharper, hyper-awareness, tactical precision, the kind of focused intensity that came from knowing exactly how thin the margin for error had become. Approaching. Initial descent point, she announced, her voice calm despite the storm raging around them. Beginning emergency power reduction. Rodriguez, I need you on the instruments. Call out any deviation from flight path. Sarah ... Rodriguez's voice held a note of something she'd never heard from him before, not doubt, but something that might have been respect. Those people down there, they have no idea they're about to be saved by the best pilot I've ever flown with. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, I want to take a moment to thank you for watching. Creating and narrating these detailed, novel-length stories takes tremendous time and research to bring you the most engaging content possible. We're embarking on a journey of nearly 50,000 words together. That's a full novella. If you're already hooked by what you've heard, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this story with someone who would enjoy it, and subscribing to the channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest stories. This is going to be an epic adventure, so get comfortable. And let's continue with this remarkable tale. 3 days earlier, Sarah Chun had been sitting in the base meteorology office at Ramstein Air Base, Germany, studying weather patterns over the Himalayas with the intensity of a chess master contemplating her next 20 moves. Charts and satellite images covered every surface of her desk, held down by coffee mugs and the weight of her perpetual worry about variables beyond anyone's control. Still planning for missions that don't exist, Chun. The voice belonged to Captain Jake Morrison, whose swagger preceded him into every room like a personal theme song. He was everything the Air Force recruitment posters promised, square-jawed, confident, with the kind of easy smile that made commanding officers forget his occasional lapses in judgment. Morrison had never met a dangerous mission he wouldn't volunteer for, which made him either brave or stupid, depending on who was asking. Just keeping current on conditions, Sarah replied without looking up from a particularly troubling pressure gradient forming over the Karakoram Range. Weather systems move fast in the high mountains. What looks flyable today could be a death trap tomorrow. Morrison laughed, the sound echoing off the meteorology office's metal walls. That's your problem, Chun. Always looking for reasons why something can't be done instead of figuring out how to do it anyway. You can't fly weather patterns from a desk. Sarah finally looked up, meeting his amused gaze with the steady patience she'd cultivated over years of similar conversations. And you can't bring people home by ignoring the laws of physics, but I suppose we each have our methods. The exchange might have continued, but the office door swung open to admit Colonel Patricia Harrison, the 86th Airlift Wing's Director of Operations. Harrison was a woman who had fought for every rank stripe on her uniform in an Air Force that hadn't always welcomed female aviators with open arms. She commanded respect through competence rather than charisma, and she had little patience for pilots who prioritized ego over mission success. "John Morrison, my office now." Her tone suggested this wasn't a request for friendly conversation. As they followed Harrison through the corridors of the operations building, Sarah's mind began running through possibilities: emergency deployment, training exercise, disciplinary action. She'd learned early in her career that preparation began the moment uncertainty appeared, even if that preparation was nothing more than mentally rehearsing responses to every conceivable scenario. Colonel Harrison's office reflected her approach to leadership: functional, organized, with just enough personal touches to remind visitors that real people made the life and death decisions that happened in this building every day. Photographs of aircraft-lined one-wall transports, fighters, helicopters, each representing missions where success and failure were measured in lives saved or lost. "Sit," Harrison commanded, settling behind her desk with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to making the most of limited time. "I'll get straight to the point. We've received a request from the International Mountain Rescue Organization for high-altitude extraction support. There's a research expedition trapped on K-237 people, including climbers, scientists, and local guides. Weather conditions have deteriorated beyond the capabilities of standard rescue aircraft." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. K2 was the mountain that killed experts, the peak that claimed lives with casual indifference to experience, preparation, or good intentions. The death zone above 26,000 feet was littered with the remains of climbers who had underestimated its capacity for violence. "The Pakistani government has requested international assistance," Harrison continued. "Most nations have declined due to the extreme risk factors. Weather window is narrow and closing fast. We're talking about a rescue at over 24,000 feet in conditions that would challenge the best pilots in the world." Morrison leaned forward in his chair, his eyes already bright with the prospect of impossible odds. "When do we leave, Colonel?" Harrison's gaze shifted between the two pilots, and Sarah could see calculation behind the older woman's expression, not just tactical planning, but something more complex. A decision that went beyond matching aircraft to mission requirements. "This isn't a mission for cowboy heroics, Captain Morrison. The aircraft requirements alone eliminate most of our fleet. We need something with the range to reach the Karakoram Mountains, the altitude capability to operate effectively above 20,000 feet, and the cargo capacity to extract 37 people in potentially multiple trips. More importantly, we need a pilot with the technical precision to attempt landings that exist at the very edge of what's aerodynamically possible." Sarah felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with nerves this time. Harrison was describing capabilities that favored meticulous planning over instinctive flying, preparation over improvisation. The mission aircraft will be a modified C-130J Super Hercules, equipped with specialized high-altitude rescue equipment, Harrison said, pulling a thick folder from her desk drawer. "Oxygen systems for 40 passengers, medical equipment for treating severe hypothermia and altitude sickness, specialized extraction pods for transporting injured personnel. The aircraft modifications alone represent millions of dollars in taxpayer equipment." Morrison's confidence hadn't dimmed. "I've got more hours in C-130s than anyone else in the squadron, Colonel. High-altitude mountain flying is just another challenge." "Hours logged in normal operations," Harrison replied, her tone cooling slightly. "This mission requires something different. The margin for error approaches zero. Weather conditions will be dynamic and dangerous. The landing zones are improvised at best, potentially non-existent at worst. Success depends on anticipating problems before they develop and having contingency plans for scenarios most pilots never encounter." Sarah realized she was holding her breath. Everything Harrison described played to her strengths: the obsessive preparation, the contingency planning, the ability to see potential problems before they materialized into actual disasters. For once, being the pilot who worried about everything might be exactly what a mission required. "Captain Chun," Harrison said, turning her full attention to Sarah for the first time since they'd entered the office, "what's your assessment of the operational challenges?" Sarah's mind immediately began cataloging the variables: weather systems, aircraft performance at altitude, landing zone requirements, extraction procedures, medical considerations, fuel calculations including reserves for unexpected delays, backup plans for equipment failures. The kind of comprehensive analysis that made other pilots roll their eyes, but might mean the difference between bringing people home and adding 37 more names to K2's casualty list. "The primary challenge will be weather, Colonel. The Karakoram Range creates its own weather systems that can change from flyable to deadly in minutes. Wind patterns at altitude are unpredictable, with potential for severe downdrafts and wind shear. The T-130 service ceiling gives us operational flexibility, but we'll be flying near the aircraft's performance limits in thin air that reduces both engine power and control authority." She paused, aware that Morrison was watching her with something between amusement and impatience. But Colonel Harrison was listening with the intensity of someone evaluating technical expertise rather than pilot bravado. "Landing zone selection will be critical," Sarah continued. "Traditional runway requirements are impossible at that altitude and terrain. We'll need relatively flat areas at least 1,500 feet long, preferably with natural barriers to reduce crosswind effects. Snow conditions will affect both landing and takeoff performance. Too soft and will bog down, too hard and will lose traction. Weight and balance calculations become critical when loading injured personnel and equipment in configurations we haven't trained for." Harrison nodded slowly. "And your recommendation for mission approach?" "Multiple contingency plans based on real-time weather assessment. Primary, alternate, and emergency landing zones identified before departure. Detailed performance calculations for different loading configurations. Pre-positioned equipment drops if ground conditions allow. Most importantly, continuous evaluation of abort criteria, predetermined conditions under which we turn back rather than risk becoming additional casualties." Morrison shifted impatiently in his chair. "Colonel, all due respect, but while Chun's planning her way through every possible scenario, those people are dying on that mountain. Sometimes you have to trust your skills and make the flight happen." Harrison's expression didn't change, but Sarah detected a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The colonel had been evaluating more than just technical knowledge and flying experience. She'd been looking for something that couldn't be measured in flight hours or training scores. "Captain Morrison, you're dismissed," Harrison said. "Report to Major Williams for assignment to the European transport rotation." Morrison's confidence faltered for the first time since entering the office. "Colonel, I don't understand." "This is exactly the kind of mission that requires a pilot who understands the difference between courage and recklessness," Harrison finished. "Chun, you have 48 hours to prepare for deployment to Pakistan. Your crew will include Lieutenant Rodriguez as co-pilot, Technical Sergeant Amanda Torres as loadmaster, and Staff Sergeant David Kim as flight engineer. I'm also assigning Dr. Lisa Park, a flight surgeon with high-altitude medical experience, to your manifest." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a familiar but heavier jacket. 37 lives would depend on her ability to fly an aircraft into conditions that existed at the very edge of survivable, to make decisions under pressure that would either save lives or cost them. "Colonel," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice, "I won't let them down." Harrison's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I know you won't, Captain. That's why you're going. As they left the colonel's office, Morrison fell into step beside Sarah, his earlier swagger replaced by something that might have been respect or frustration. "You know what you just signed up for, right? That mountain kills people who are better prepared than you are." Sarah paused in the hallway, considering her response. For years, she'd absorbed comments about her nervousness, her over-preparation, her tendency to worry about variables beyond anyone's control. She'd wondered if her colleagues were right, if confidence was more important than competence, if the ability to act decisively mattered more than the wisdom to act correctly. "Jake," she said finally, "I think maybe that's the point. The mountain kills people who think they're better prepared than they actually are. It kills people who trust their luck more than their planning. It kills people who mistake confidence for skill." She started walking toward the operations planning room, where 48 hours of intensive preparation would begin immediately. Behind her, Morrison called out, "Just remember, Chun, all the planning in the world won't help if you're too scared to execute when the moment comes." Sarah didn't turn around. She had work to do. The aircraft hangar at Ramstein Air Base hummed with purposeful activity as maintenance crews swarmed over the modified C-130J Super Hercules, designated Phoenix 1. Sarah stood beneath the massive aircraft's nose, watching technicians install specialized oxygen systems and high-altitude rescue equipment with the focused intensity of someone who understood that mechanical precision would soon translate directly into human survival. "Captain Chun?" The voice belonged to a young woman in flight coveralls, her lieutenant's bars so new they practically gleamed. "I'm Rodriguez, your co-pilot for this mission." Sarah turned to face Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez, immediately revising her initial impression. Rodriguez wasn't young. The lines around his eyes suggested someone in his late 20s, who'd seen enough military service to understand that rank and experience didn't always correlate. His handshake was firm without being aggressive, and his direct gaze held the kind of quiet confidence that came from competence rather than ego. "Marcus Rodriguez," he continued, "I know what you're thinking, Lieutenant, with a captain's mission. I transferred from the Navy 6 months ago. 10 years flying helicopters off destroyers, including 2 deployments to Afghanistan for mountain rescue operations. When Colonel Harrison briefed me on this mission, I specifically requested assignment to your crew." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Specifically requested?" Most pilots are trying to avoid flying with the nervous captain who checks everything twice. Rodriguez smiled, the expression transforming his serious features. "Captain, I've flown enough rescue missions to know the difference between nervous and careful. Nervous pilots second-guess themselves at critical moments. Careful pilots do the planning work that keeps everyone alive when critical moments arrive. After reviewing your service record and talking to people who've flown with you, I know which category you fall into." Before Sarah could respond, a new voice interrupted their conversation. "If you two are done with the Mutual Admiration Society, we've got equipment to inspect." The speaker was a woman in her early 30s with the kind of compact, efficient build that suggested military service had shaped more than just her career choices. Technical Sergeant Amanda Torres wore her authority like a well-fitted uniform present, but not ostentatious, earned rather than assumed. "Torres, Loadmaster," she continued, extending a hand to Sarah. 12 years managing cargo and everything from transport runs to combat drops. I've read the mission profile, Captain. We're looking at extracting 37 people under conditions that will push both the aircraft and crew to operational limits. I need to know you're going to get us there and back without turning my cargo bay into a casualty ward." Sarah appreciated Torres's directness. Loadmasters carried enormous responsibility for mission success. They managed weight and balance, supervised cargo loading and unloading, operated the aircraft's defensive systems when required, and served as additional eyes and hands during critical phases of flight. A good loadmaster could save a mission. A bad one could kill everyone aboard. "Sergeant Torres," Sarah replied, I can promise you that I'll do everything in my power to bring everyone home safely, but I need the same commitment from you. This mission will require flexibility, quick thinking, and the ability to manage chaos under pressure. Torres nodded approvingly. That's what I expected to hear, Captain. Now let me show you what we're working with. She led them into the aircraft's cavernous cargo bay, which had been transformed into something resembling a mobile medical facility. Specialized stretchers designed for high-altitude transport lined the walls. Oxygen bottles and medical equipment filled every available space. Emergency sleeping bags and thermal blankets were stacked in precise rows, ready for distribution to hypothermic survivors. The aircraft modifications are impressive, Torres explained, running her hand along a bank of oxygen monitors. But they come with trade-offs. All this equipment adds weight, which reduces our fuel capacity and limits our operational flexibility. We'll need to calculate passenger loads carefully to maintain safety margins for takeoff and landing. A fourth voice joined the conversation as Staff Sergeant David Kim emerged from beneath an engine cowling, his uniform marked with the honest grime of mechanical work. Kim moved with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that mechanical failure at 25,000 feet offered limited options for roadside assistance. Captain Chun, Kim said, wiping his hands on a maintenance rag, I'm your flight engineer for this adventure. I've been over this bird with a microscope for the past 6 hours. The modifications are solid, but we're asking the aircraft to perform outside normal parameters. Engine performance at altitude will be reduced, which affects both our climb rate and our ability to maintain level flight in turbulence. Sarah appreciated Kim's technical honesty. Flight engineers served as the aircraft's mechanical conscience, monitoring systems and performance parameters that could mean the difference between successful completion and emergency landing. Their expertise became critical during missions that pushed aircraft to operational limits. What's your assessment of our capabilities, Sergeant Kim? The C-130 is a tough bird, Captain. She'd do what we ask of her, but we need to respect her limits. Fuel consumption increases significantly at high altitude. Engine power decreases as air density drops. Control response becomes sluggish in thin air. All manageable, but we need to plan for degraded performance rather than optimal conditions. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their final team member. Dr. Lisa Park approached with the efficient stride of someone accustomed to emergency situations, her medical bag slung across her shoulder like a pilot's flight case. Park appeared to be in her mid-30s, with the kind of calm competence that suggested extensive experience managing medical crises under less than ideal conditions. Captain Chun, Dr. Park said, I'm your flight surgeon for this mission. I've reviewed the medical intelligence on the trapped personnel. We're looking at potential cases of severe hypothermia, altitude sickness, frostbite, and possible traumatic injuries from avalanche exposure. Some of these people will need immediate medical intervention during extraction. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest that accompanied increased responsibility. 37 lives were depending on her ability to fly an aircraft into one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. But the mission's success would depend equally on her team's ability to work together under extreme pressure. Dr. Park, Sarah said, what are our limitations for treating patients during flight? The aircraft medical equipment is excellent, Park replied, but we're still talking about emergency medicine at 25,000 feet in a turbulent aircraft. 4 lines become difficult to maintain. Patient monitoring is complicated by vibration and noise. Some medications become less effective at altitude. Most importantly, our ability to evacuate critically ill patients is limited. We either complete the mission successfully, or we all face the same environmental challenges. Rodriguez nodded grimly. No pressure. Torres laughed, the sound echoing in the aircraft's metal interior. Welcome to Special Operations, Lieutenant. The impossible missions are the only ones worth attempting. Kim looked up from the engine diagnostics panel he'd been studying. Captain, I recommend we run full systems checks every 4 hours during the deployment phase. The environmental conditions we'll be operating in can cause equipment failures that don't show up during normal pre-flight inspections. Sarah pulled out the notebook she'd been carrying since flight school. Its pages filled with checklists, calculations, and contingency plans accumulated over years of operational flying. I want to run through our mission profile step by step. I know everyone here is experienced, but this mission requires coordination beyond what any of us have attempted before. She opened to a page covered with approach diagrams and performance. Calculations. Our destination is Concordia Base Camp, approximately 16,000 feet elevation. The trapped personnel are distributed across 3 locations on the north face of K2, ranging from 18,000 to 24,000 feet. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. We have perhaps a 6-hour window before conditions become impossible. Dr. Park studied the elevation figures. Those altitudes put everyone in the death zone. Oxygen levels are insufficient to sustain human life indefinitely. Even healthy climbers begin deteriorating within hours. Which is why we can't afford to make this a multi-day operation, Sarah continued. Single mission, maximum extraction. Capability with contingency planning for equipment failures or weather delays. Torres, what's our passenger capacity under these conditions? Torres consulted her own notebook, filled with weight and balance calculations. Standard passenger configuration would be 54 people. But standard passengers aren't hypothermic, potentially injured, and requiring individual oxygen support. Realistically, we're looking at 20 to 25 people per trip, assuming we can manage the medical requirements. Sarah felt the familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. 25 people per trip meant at least 2 flights into conditions that were already at the edge of survivable. Each additional landing increased the risk of mechanical failure, weather deterioration, or pilot error. But leaving people behind wasn't an option. Rodriguez, what's your experience with high-altitude landings? Navy helicopter operations included mountain rescue up to 12,000 feet, Rodriguez replied. Different aircraft, but similar challenges with thin air, unpredictable winds, and limited landing options. The key is understanding that everything happens slower at altitude: engine response, control input, even your own thinking if you're not properly oxygenated. Kim nodded in agreement. Aircraft performance degrades predictably with altitude, but pilot performance can deteriorate without. Warning: hypoxia affects judgment before you realize you're impaired. We'll all be on oxygen from takeoff to landing. Dr. Park opened her medical bag and began checking supplies. I'm carrying medications for treating severe hypothermia, altitude sickness, and traumatic injuries. But our primary medical strategy needs to be rapid evacuation to proper facilities. The longer those people remain at altitude, the more their condition will deteriorate. Sarah closed her notebook, having confirmed what she'd already suspected. This mission existed at the intersection of possible and impossible, where success would depend on preparation meeting opportunity under conditions that allowed no margin for error. All right, she said, looking at each team member in turn. We have 36 hours to prepare for a mission that will test everything we think we know about flying, medicine, and teamwork. I want each of you to understand that we're not just trying to extract 37 people from a mountain. We're trying to prove that careful planning and coordinated execution can overcome impossible odds. Torres grinned. Captain, I've been waiting my entire career for a mission that matters this much. Kim wiped his hands on his maintenance rag, leaving fresh grease stains. The aircraft will be ready. Question is whether the mountain will let us succeed. Rodriguez checked his watch. Weather brief is in 2 hours. Flight planning session after that. Departure is scheduled for 0400 tomorrow. Dr. Park shouldered her medical bag. I'll coordinate with the Pakistani medical authorities for ground support at our destination. We'll need ambulance transport standing by for immediate evacuation to hospitals. As the team dispersed to begin their individual preparations, Sarah remained beneath the aircraft, looking up at the machine that would soon carry them all into one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. The C-130 was a reliable workhorse, proven in countless operations across decades of military service. But tomorrow would test both aircraft and crew, beyond anything they'd experienced before. She pulled out her notebook again and began writing. Mission success factors: weather, aircraft performance, crew coordination, passenger medical condition, landing zone selection, fuel management, backup planning. The list could extend indefinitely, but eventually preparation had to yield to execution. Tomorrow, she would discover whether 12 years of careful flying had prepared her for the mission of her career. Sarah's quarters at Ramstein Air Base looked like a meteorologist's office had collided with a flight planning center during a particularly violent storm. Weather charts covered every horizontal surface, held down by coffee mugs, flight manuals, and the accumulated weight of obsessive preparation. Satellite images of the Karakoram Mountains were taped to the walls, annotated with wind patterns. Pressure gradients and elevation contours marked in different colored pens that it was 0200 hours, but sleep had proved as elusive as favorable weather forecasts. Sarah sat cross-legged on her narrow military cot, surrounded by the tools of her trade: approach plates, performance charts, emergency procedures, and the thick folder containing everything known about high-altitude rescue operations in extreme weather conditions. Her laptop displayed a real-time weather feed from Pakistan, updating every 30 minutes with information that grew more discouraging with each refresh. The knock on her door came as she was calculating fuel consumption rates for different passenger loads, trying to balance range requirements against the weight of people whose lives would depend on her ability to make the numbers work. She opened the door to find Dr. Lisa Park, looking as wide awake as Sarah felt tired. "Can't sleep either?" Dr. Park asked, noting the controlled chaos of Sarah's room. "Mind if I come in? I have some questions about the medical aspects of our mission." Sarah stepped aside, gesturing toward the room's single chair while settling back onto her cot. "I'm beginning to think sleep is overrated anyway. What's on your mind, Doc?" Dr. Park picked up one of the weather charts, studying the pressure patterns with the focused attention of someone who understood that atmospheric conditions could affect more than just flight operations. "I've been reviewing the medical intelligence on our passengers. The situation is worse than the initial report suggested." She pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through medical data. 37 people have been trapped above 18,000 feet for 4 days. Oxygen supplies are nearly exhausted. Outside temperatures are dropping to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. We're looking at advanced hypothermia, severe altitude sickness, possible frostbite, and at least 6 people who may have suffered traumatic injuries during the initial avalanche. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest. "How does that affect our extraction procedures?" "Some of these people will need immediate medical intervention just to survive the flight to lower altitude," Dr. Park replied. 4 fluids for dehydration, oxygen support for altitude sickness, active rewarming for hypothermia. In ideal conditions, I'd want each patient in a hospital, ICU. Instead, I'll be treating them in the back of a cargo plane while flying through mountain turbulence. Sarah nodded grimly. "What do you need from the flight crew?" "The smoothest possible flight profile," Dr. Park said immediately. "Turbulence affects everything I'll be trying to do. 4 lines. Patient monitoring, even basic. Assessment procedures. I know weather conditions won't be ideal, but any stability you can give me will directly translate into lives saved." Sarah made a note in her mission planning folder. Smooth flight profile might sound simple, but in the conditions they expected to encounter, it would require constant attention to power settings, airspeed management, and altitude control. The aircraft would want to buck and pitch in the mountain winds. Keeping it stable would demand total concentration from both pilots. "There's something else," Dr. Park continued, her expression growing more serious. 6 of the trapped personnel are local Pakistani guides. They've been at altitude longer than the international team, which means their medical condition is likely to be worse. But they also have experience with high-altitude survival that might be keeping them alive longer than would normally be expected. Experience cuts both ways at that altitude, Sarah observed. They know how to conserve energy and body heat, but they also know exactly how dangerous their situation has become. Dr. Park nodded. The psychological factor is significant. Hope can be a powerful medicine, but despair can kill people just as effectively as hypothermia. When we arrive, some of these people may have given up on being rescued. Getting them motivated to move, to cooperate with evacuation procedures, could be challenging. Sarah looked at the weather charts covering her desk, noting the wind speeds and temperature readings that painted a picture of conditions bordering on unsurvivable. "How long do you estimate they have if we don't reach them? Honestly, some of them may already be beyond help. The human body can survive extreme conditions for remarkable periods, but only with adequate shelter, oxygen, and body heat. After 4 days in the death zone, we're racing against biological processes that don't care about our mission timeline." The blunt medical assessment hit Sarah like physical weight. 37 people were counting on her ability to fly an aircraft into conditions that pushed the boundaries of possible. But even reaching them might not be enough if their medical condition had deteriorated beyond recovery. A second knock interrupted her thoughts. This time, Rodriguez and Torres stood in the hallway, both looking as wakeful as everyone else seemed. "To be at 0230 hours. Couldn't sleep," Rodriguez said simply. "Figured we might as well be productive with our insomnia." Torres has some concerns about passenger loading procedures. Torres entered carrying a thick manual and several pages of handwritten calculations. "I've been running weight and balance numbers for different passenger configurations. The medical equipment adds significant weight, but the real challenge is going to be loading injured people who can't assist with their own movement." She spread her calculations across Sarah's already crowded desk. "Standard passenger loading assumes people can walk up the ramp and take assigned seats. We're looking at unconscious patients, people with injuries that limit mobility, and others who may be too weak from altitude sickness to follow normal procedures. Loading time could extend significantly." Sarah studied Torres's numbers, seeing immediately why the loadmaster was concerned. Extended ground time at high altitude meant increased exposure to weather conditions that could deteriorate rapidly. An aircraft sitting on the ground was vulnerable to wind gusts, temperature changes, and mechanical problems that could strand everyone at the same altitude that was slowly killing their passengers. "What's your recommendation?" Sarah asked. "Rapid loading procedures," Torres replied without hesitation. "We go in with a plan that assumes worst-case patient conditions. Medical personnel board first to begin immediate treatment. Ambulatory passengers assist with loading those who need help. Aircraft engines remain running throughout ground operations to minimize turnaround time." Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "Engines running also gives us immediate response capability if weather conditions change suddenly. No startup procedures if we need to abort quickly." Dr. Park looked up from the medical data she'd been reviewing. "From a medical standpoint, that makes sense. The sooner we can begin descent to thicker air and warmer temperatures, the better our chances of successful patient outcomes." Sarah felt the pieces of mission planning falling into place with the satisfying precision of a complex puzzle solving itself. Each team member brought expertise that complemented the others, creating a comprehensive approach that addressed the mission's multiple challenges simultaneously. "All right," Sarah said, pulling out a fresh page in her notebook. "Let's walk through the entire mission profile from takeoff to passenger delivery. I want everyone to understand not just their own responsibilities, but how their actions affect everyone else's ability to succeed. She began sketching a timeline across the top of the page. Departure from Ramstein at 040 local time gives us optimal arrival at the rescue site during the predicted weather window. Flight time to Pakistan is approximately 8 hours, including one refueling stop in Turkey. Rodriguez consulted his own notes. Turkish authorities have confirmed fuel availability and expedited clearance procedures. Ground time should be minimal 30 minutes maximum for refueling and crew rest. Ground time in Turkey also gives us a final weather update before committing to the mountain approach, Sarah continued. If conditions have deteriorated beyond flyable limits, that's our last opportunity to abort without endangering the rescue team. Dr. Park raised a concern that had been troubling her. What if we arrive at the rescue site and discover that some of the trapped personnel have died? Do we still attempt extraction of survivors, or does that change our mission parameters? The question hung in the air with uncomfortable weight. Sarah had been considering the same possibility, but hearing it voiced made the reality more immediate. Rescue missions sometimes became recovery operations, and the emotional impact on crews could affect decision-making at critical moments. We extract every living person we can reach, Sarah said firmly, but we don't risk additional lives for recovery operations. The mission succeeds if we bring home survivors, not if we account for every person who was originally trapped. Torres nodded grimly, understood. I'll plan loading procedures for maximum flexibility. We may need to adjust passenger configurations based on medical conditions we encounter. The conversation was interrupted by the distinctive sound of aircraft engines starting up somewhere on the flight line. Through the small window of Sarah's quarters, they could see the navigation lights of a C-17 Globemaster beginning its taxi toward the active runway, bound for some mission that required movement through the darkness of early morning. That could be us in 2 hours, Rodriguez observed. Last chance to voice concerns or suggest modifications to our approach. Sarah looked around the room at her team members, noting the combination of determination and anxiety that marked everyone's expressions. They were about to attempt something that existed at the very edge of possible, using skills and equipment that had never been tested under the conditions they expected to encounter. I have a confession to make, she said, setting down her pen, and meeting each person's gaze in turn. For most of my career, people have questioned whether I have the confidence necessary for challenging missions. They've called me nervous, overly cautious, too focused on what could go wrong instead of what needs to be done. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am nervous. But I've learned that nervousness and competence aren't mutually exclusive. Being nervous means I consider every variable, plan for every contingency, and refuse to assume that luck will compensate for inadequate preparation. Dr. Park smiled slightly. Captain, I've worked with pilots who had complete confidence in their abilities right up until the moment their overconfidence killed people. I'll take nervous competence over reckless confidence any day. Torres laughed. Besides, nervous pilots do better pre-flight inspections. I've never seen anyone check systems as thoroughly as you do, Captain. That attention to detail might be exactly what keeps us alive tomorrow. Rodriguez nodded in agreement. The best helicopter pilots I served with in the Navy shared one characteristic. They worried about everything that could go wrong, which meant they were prepared when things actually did go wrong. Confidence is nice, but preparation saves lives. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, not the familiar anxiety she'd carried for years, but a different kind of energy that felt more like resolve than nervousness. Her team wasn't just accepting her cautious approach. They were recognizing it as exactly what the mission required. In that case, she said, standing up and beginning to gather the weather charts scattered across her room, let's channel all this nervous energy into final mission preparation. I want to review emergency procedures, backup landing sites, and communication protocols one more time before we commit to this operation." Dr. Park stood as well, shouldering her medical bag. "I'll do final equipment checks and coordinate with Pakistani medical authorities for ground support at our destination." Torres consulted her watch. "I need 2 more hours to complete passenger loading calculations and verify cargo securing procedures. This mission is going to test every system on the aircraft." Rodriguez moved toward the door. "Weather brief in 45 minutes, followed by final flight planning. After that, we either go or we find reasons to stay home." As her team members left to complete their individual preparations, Sarah remained in her quarters, looking at the organized chaos of charts, calculations, and contingency plans that covered every surface. Tomorrow would test whether 12 years of careful preparation had equipped her for the mission that would define her career. She picked up her notebook and added, "One final entry. Mission success depends on the integration of careful planning, skilled execution, and the ability to adapt when conditions exceed expectations. Nervousness is not the enemy of success, overconfidence is." The clock on her desk read 0300 hours. In 1 hour, she would begin the mission that 37 people were counting on her to complete successfully. For once in her career, being the nervous pilot might be exactly what everyone needed. The pre-dawn darkness at Ramstein Air Base felt heavier than usual as Sarah completed her walk-around inspection of Phoenix 1, her flashlight beam playing across control surfaces, engine intakes, and landing gear with the methodical precision that had become second nature over 12 years of military flying. The aircraft sat on the tarmac like a sleeping giant, its bulk reassuring in the pale wash of runway lights. "Looks good, Captain," Staff Sergeant Kim called from beneath the starboard wing, where he'd been checking fluid levels and mechanical connections with the thoroughness of someone who understood that mechanical failure at 25,000 feet offered limited options for emergency landing. "All systems green, fuel load complete, cargo secured." Sarah nodded, making notes on her pre-flight checklist with movements that had become ritual. Each checkmark represented a potential failure mode eliminated, a variable controlled, a margin of safety preserved for when conditions became challenging. Her team had learned to appreciate this methodical approach rather than questioning it. "Weather update," Rodriguez announced, approaching with a folder thick enough to suggest complications. "The news isn't good. Wind conditions over the Karakoram Range are deteriorating faster than predicted. Pakistani Meteorological Service is reporting gusts to 80 knots at altitude, with the possibility of severe turbulence extending down to 15,000 feet. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest, but the sensation felt different, now less like anxiety, more like heightened awareness. "How does that affect our timeline?" "Weather window is compressing," Rodriguez replied, opening the folder to reveal satellite images marked with pressure gradients and wind vectors. "If we maintain our current departure schedule, we should arrive during the final hours of marginally flyable conditions. Delay the mission by more than 2 hours, and we'll be looking at weather that grounds everything with wings." Dr. Park emerged from the aircraft's cargo bay, her medical equipment checks complete. "I've been in contact with the International Mountain Rescue Organization. The situation on K2 is deteriorating rapidly. 3 more people have lost consciousness from oxygen deprivation. Without immediate evacuation, we're going to lose people before we can reach them." The weight of urgency settled over the team like a physical presence. Sarah looked at her watch. 0345 hours. Scheduled departure was in 15 minutes, but the compressed weather window meant they were racing against atmospheric conditions that changed by the hour rather than the day. "Torres, what's our passenger capacity under maximum loading conditions?" Sarah asked. The loadmaster consulted her calculations, pages covered with weight and balance figures that represented the difference. between successful extraction and aircraft performance that degraded beyond safe limits. If we push to absolute maximum capacity, we can extract all 37 people in a single trip. But we'll be operating at gross weight limits that eliminate our safety margins. Sarah processed the implications immediately. Maximum weight loading meant reduced climb performance, longer takeoff distances, higher fuel consumption, and decreased ability to handle emergency situations. On the other hand, a single extraction flight meant exposing the rescue team to dangerous conditions only once, rather than making multiple trips that multiplied the opportunities for weather-related disasters. Single trip extraction, she decided. We go in heavy, get everyone aboard, and get out before conditions deteriorate further. Rodriguez, recalculate our fuel requirements for maximum gross weight operations. Rodriguez pulled out his electronic flight computer, fingers moving rapidly across performance tables that would determine whether the mission remained within the boundaries of possible. Fuel burn increases significantly at maximum weight, especially at the altitudes we'll be operating. We'll need to confirm refueling availability in in Turkey and possibly identify an alternate airport if weather delays extend our flight time. Kim emerged from his final engine inspection, wiping his hands on the maintenance rag that seemed permanently attached to his uniform. Captain, I need to brief you on aircraft performance limitations at maximum gross weight. Engine power margins decrease, which affects our ability to maintain altitude in severe turbulence. Control response becomes sluggish, especially during approach and landing phases. Sarah appreciated Kim's directness. Flight engineers serve as the aircraft's mechanical conscience, providing honest assessments of capabilities and limitations that could mean the difference between mission success and disaster. Their expertise became critical during operations that pushed aircraft beyond normal parameters. What's your assessment of our operational envelope? Sarah asked. The C-130 is built for this kind of abuse, Kim replied with the confidence of someone who had maintained military aircraft through decades of challenging operations. But we need to respect the laws of physics. Slower acceleration, longer stopping. Distances, reduced climb rate, increased susceptibility to turbulence. All manageable if we plan for degraded performance rather than optimal conditions. Dr. Park looked up from her medical equipment inventory. From a patient care standpoint, single-trip extraction makes sense. The longer those people remain at altitude, the more their condition deteriorates. Even unconscious patients have a better chance of survival if we can get them to lower altitude and proper medical facilities quickly. Sarah felt the mission parameters crystallizing with the clarity that came from eliminating alternatives. Single-trip extraction at maximum gross weight during the final hours of marginal weather conditions into terrain that offered limited options for emergency procedures. The mission existed at the intersection of necessary and impossible. All right, she said, looking at each team member in turn. We're committed. Maximum extraction, single trip, departure in 10 minutes. Everyone understand their responsibilities? Torres shouldered her equipment bag with the efficient movements of someone preparing for challenging work. Cargo bays configured for maximum passenger loading. Medical equipment is secured but accessible. Emergency equipment is positioned for rapid deployment. Rodriguez tucked his weather folder under his arm. Flight plan is filed. Fuel calculations are complete. Alternate airports are identified. Turkish authorities have confirmed expedited clearance and refueling availability. Dr. Park gathered her medical supplies with the methodical precision of someone who understood that organization now would determine effectiveness later. Medical equipment is ready for immediate deployment. Pakistani medical authorities are standing by for ground support and hospital transport. Kim performed one final check of his engine monitoring equipment. Aircraft systems are nominal. All backup procedures are reviewed and ready for implementation. Sarah climbed the crew ladder into Phoenix One's cockpit, settling into the pilot's seat that would be her command center for the next 12 hours. The instrument panel glowed with the familiar array of gauges, displays, and warning lights that had guided her through hundreds of previous missions. But tonight was different. Tonight, 37 lives depended on her ability to fly an aircraft into conditions that existed at the very edge of survivable. "Tower, Phoenix One ready for departure," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. "Phoenix One, cleared for takeoff runway 26. Winds 320 at 15, gusts to 25. Altimeter 29902. Sarah advanced the throttles, feeling the familiar surge of power as 4 turboprop engines spooled up to takeoff thrust. The aircraft began rolling down the runway, gathering speed with the ponderous determination of a machine designed for reliability rather than elegance. "Rotation speed," Rodriguez called out, monitoring airspeed with the focused attention that marked professional aviators. Sarah pulled back on the yoke, and Phoenix One lifted into the pre-dawn darkness, climbing toward an altitude that would carry them over the Atlantic Ocean, across Europe, and eventually into the mountain ranges where 37 people were running out of time and hope. As Germany fell away beneath them, Sarah began the long process of systems monitoring and course management that would occupy the next 8 hours. But her mind was already focused on the approach they would attempt at the end of this flight, a landing in conditions that would test everything she thought she knew about flying. "First waypoint in 15 minutes, Rodriguez announced, settling into the rhythm of long-range navigation. "Weather updates every 30 minutes. Fuel monitoring continuous." Sarah nodded, her hands steady on the controls as Phoenix One climbed through the European night sky. Behind them, 37 people were trapped on a mountain that had claimed hundreds of lives over the decades. Ahead of them lay a mission that would either prove the value of careful preparation or demonstrate the limits of human capability in the face of natural forces that acknowledged no authority beyond the laws of physics. The nervous pilot was heading into the storm. 8 hours into the flight, Phoenix One descended through scattered clouds toward Incirlik Air Base in Turkey, the halfway point that would determine whether their mission continued toward the mountains or ended in the relative safety of a planned abort. Sarah's hands moved across the instrument panel with the automatic precision of someone who had performed similar approaches hundreds of times, but her mind remained focused on weather reports that grew more ominous with each update. "Incirlik Tower, Phoenix One requesting priority landing for humanitarian mission," Rodriguez transmitted, his voice carrying the controlled urgency that marked emergency operations. "Fuel critical, medical evacuation mission, request expedited." "Ground handling. Phoenix One, cleared direct approach runway 05. Emergency equipment standing by. Humanitarian priority approved." Sarah felt the aircraft's weight as she configured for landing, not just the physical mass of fuel, equipment, and crew, but the emotional weight of 37 lives that depended on decisions she would make over the next few hours. The landing gear extended with mechanical precision, but she knew that the real test lay ahead in mountains, where mechanical precision might not be enough. "Latest weather from Pakistan," Dr. Park announced from the cargo bay, where she had been monitoring. "Communication with International Mountain Rescue. Conditions are deteriorating faster than predicted. Wind speeds at the rescue site are approaching the limits of helicopter operations. We may be the only aircraft capable of reaching those people." The implications hit Sarah immediately. If weather conditions eliminated helicopter support, Phoenix One would be operating without backup, without the safety net of alternative rescue assets that could provide assistance if something went wrong. They would be alone on a mountain that had proven its capacity for killing even experienced mountaineers. "Ground time in Turkey?" Sarah asked, beginning her approach checklist with movements that had become second nature. Torres consulted her loading calculations. 15 minutes for refueling, crew rest, and final weather assessment. Longer than that, and we miss our weather window completely. The aircraft touched down on Incirlik's runway with the solid impact of a machine carrying maximum gross weight. Sarah felt the landing gear absorb the energy of touchdown, then applied reverse thrust and brakes with the measured control that prevented skidding on surfaces that might be contaminated with morning moisture. "Good landing," Rodriguez observed, monitoring their deceleration with the focused attention that marked professional flying. Ground speed decreasing, all systems nominal. As Phoenix 1 taxied toward the fuel pits, Sarah could see ground crews already preparing for rapid turnaround. Turkish military personnel moved with the efficient urgency of people who understood that humanitarian missions operated on timelines measured in human survival rather than administrative convenience. "Captain Chun," Dr. Park called from the passenger compartment. "I'm receiving updated medical intelligence from the rescue site. The situation is worse than we initially thought." Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she shut down engines and activated the aircraft's auxiliary power unit. "How much worse?" Dr. Park emerged from the cargo bay, carrying a tablet displaying medical data that painted a grim picture of human endurance pushed beyond normal limits. 6 people have lost consciousness completely. Oxygen supplies are nearly exhausted. Outside, temperatures dropped to -50 degrees Fahrenheit during the night. "We're looking at medical conditions that may be irreversible even if we reach them immediately." The weight of urgency pressed against Sarah's chest like physical pressure. Every minute of delay increased the likelihood that their rescue mission would become a recovery operation, that they would arrive to find people who had died while waiting for help that came too late. "Fuel status?" she asked Kim, who was already coordinating with Turkish ground crews. "Tanks will be topped off in 8 minutes, Kim replied, monitoring the refueling operation with the careful attention that prevented fuel system contamination. "All systems checks complete, aircraft ready for immediate departure." Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit, carrying weather charts that revealed the narrow window of opportunity they were racing to exploit. Latest meteorological analysis shows a brief improvement in conditions over the next 3 hours, followed by a storm system that will make flight operations impossible for at least 24 hours. Sarah studied the weather patterns, seeing immediately why other nations had declined to attempt rescue operations. The window of flyable conditions was narrowing by the hour, compressed between storm systems that approached from multiple directions simultaneously. By tomorrow, weather conditions would eliminate any possibility of aircraft operations in the target area. "This is our only chance," she realized aloud. "If we don't go now, those people will die before conditions improve enough for another rescue attempt." Torres finished her final passenger loading calculations, pages covered with figures that represented the balance between aircraft capability and human survival. "Captain, I need to brief you on the reality of maximum weight operations. High altitude. We'll be operating beyond normal safety margins in conditions that don't allow for pilot error." Sarah appreciated Torres's honesty. Loadmasters carried enormous responsibility for aircraft balance and performance, especially during operations that pushed beyond standard parameters. Their expertise could prevent disasters that would otherwise result from exceeding aircraft. "Limitations. What are our constraints?" Sarah asked. "Maximum gross weight limits our climb rate and reduces our ability to maintain altitude in severe turbulence," Torres explained, her calculations revealing the narrow margins that separated success from disaster. "Takeoff distance increases significantly, especially at high elevation airports. Most importantly, our ability to execute emergency procedures becomes compromised when operating at weight limits." Dr. Park looked up from her medical equipment inventory. "From a patient care standpoint, we need to understand that some of the people we're trying to save may not survive the extraction process. Severe hypothermia, oxygen deprivation, and potential traumatic injuries create medical conditions that can be fatal even during successful rescue operations. The brutal assessment forced Sarah to confront the reality that successful completion of their mission might still result in casualties. They were racing against biological processes that didn't respect heroic intentions or careful planning. Some of the 37 people they hoped to save might be beyond help regardless of their efforts. Fuel loading complete, Kim announced, supervising the disconnection of ground equipment with the methodical precision that prevented operational delays. Aircraft ready for departure. Weather window remains open for approximately 2 more hours. Sarah felt the moment of decision approaching with the inevitability of atmospheric pressure systems that acknowledge no human authority. They could abort the mission and return to Germany with the knowledge that they had attempted the impossible but refused to accept suicidal risk. Or they could continue toward mountains where 37 people were depending on their willingness to fly into conditions that existed at the very edge of survivable. Crew meeting, she announced, gathering her team in the aircraft's cargo bay where they could speak without shouting over engine noise. I want everyone to understand exactly what we're committing to if we continue this mission. She pulled out the weather charts Rodriguez had updated during their ground stop. Weather conditions at the rescue site are at the absolute limits of aircraft operations. Wind speeds approaching 70 knots, with severe turbulence extending down to 15,000 feet. Temperature and atmospheric pressure conditions that will push both aircraft and crew performance to maximum capability. Rodriguez nodded grimly. Single approach opportunity. If we can't complete landing on the first attempt, weather conditions may not allow a second try. Torres consulted her loading calculations. Maximum gross weight operations eliminate our safety margins. Normal emergency procedures become unavailable when operating at aircraft limits. Dr. Park shouldered her medical bag with the resolute movement of someone who had made her decision. Some of the people we're trying to save may die during the rescue attempt. Medical conditions may have deteriorated beyond recovery. But without this mission, all 37 people will certainly die within the next 12 hours. Kim completed his final systems check, wiping his hands on the maintenance rag that had become his signature accessory. Aircraft is ready. Question is whether we're ready to push beyond everything we've been trained to consider safe. Sarah looked at each team member, seeing determination rather than doubt in their expressions. They understood the risks, accepted the limitations, and remained committed to attempting something that existed at the intersection of necessary and impossible. Everyone aboard, she decided. We're going to bring those people home. As Phoenix, one lifted off from Turkish soil and climbed toward the mountain ranges that guarded their destination. Sarah felt the weight of command settling across her shoulders like a familiar but heavier jacket. Behind them lay the safety of abort options and alternative courses of action. Ahead lay a mission that would test everything they thought they knew about flying, teamwork, and the limits of human capability. The nervous pilot was crossing the threshold into conditions that would either validate 12 years of careful preparation or demonstrate that some challenges exceeded the boundaries of careful planning. The Karakoram Mountains rose from the Pakistani landscape like the vertebrae of some primordial dragon, their snow-covered peaks piercing the thin air at altitudes where human survival became a constant battle against the fundamental hostility of the environment. Sarah pressed her face against the cockpit window as Phoenix 1 climbed through 20,000 feet, watching the terrain below transform from the brown valleys of civilization to the white wasteland, where 37 people were fighting for their lives. First visual contact with K2, Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying a note of awe that even experienced aviators felt when confronting the world's second highest mountain. The peak dominated the horizon like a massive pyramid of ice and stone, its north face scarred by avalanche chutes and vertical walls that had claimed hundreds of lives over the decades. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she studied the mountain. through binoculars, searching for any sign of the stranded expedition. Somewhere on those wind-swept slopes, people were huddled in emergency shelters, breathing bottled oxygen that grew more precious with each passing hour, waiting for a rescue that most experts had declared impossible. Radio contact established. With ground control, Dr. Park announced from the communications station she had established in the cargo bay. International Mountain Rescue is reporting deteriorating conditions at all 3 rescue sites. 2 people have stopped responding to radio calls. Oxygen supplies are now critical for the entire group. The news hit Sarah like physical impact. They had perhaps 2 hours before oxygen deprivation began claiming lives. But the mountain environment ahead looked like something from another planet, a landscape designed to kill anything that attempted to survive at such altitude. Terrain. Assessment, she called to Torres, who had been studying approach charts and satellite images with the focused intensity of someone calculating margins between success and disaster. 3 potential landing zones identified, Torres replied, spreading maps across her workstation. Primary site is a glacial plateau at 16,800 feet, approximately 2 miles from the nearest rescue location. Surface appears relatively flat, but we're talking about landing on ice that may not support aircraft weight. Sarah studied the approach charts, noting wind patterns and elevation contours that would affect their ability to reach the landing zone safely. Backup sites? Secondary location is lower elevation, but farther from rescue sites. Would require ground transportation across terrain that may be impassable for injured personnel. Emergency site is a valley floor at 14,000 feet, but approach requires flying through a narrow canyon with vertical walls that could create severe wind shear. Rodriguez checked his navigation instruments, confirming their position relative to the rescue coordinates. 20 minutes to initial approach point. Weather is holding within marginally flyable limits, but conditions could deteriorate rapidly. Sarah felt the familiar weight of command decisions that would determine whether people lived or died. Each landing site offered different combinations of risk and accessibility. The primary site provided closest access to trapped personnel, but required landing on uncertain terrain at an altitude that pushed aircraft performance to its limits. Backup sites were safer for the aircraft, but might delay rescue operations beyond the point where medical intervention could save lives. Kim, what's our aircraft performance at 16,800 feet? The flight engineer consulted performance charts that revealed the harsh mathematics of high-altitude operations. Engine power decreases significantly in thin air. Takeoff and landing distances increase. Control response becomes sluggish. Most importantly, our ability to execute emergency procedures becomes limited when operating near aircraft service ceiling. Dr. Park looked up from medical intelligence updates she had been receiving. From ground control. Captain, I need to brief you on what we're likely to encounter when we reach the rescue sites. Some of these people have been unconscious for hours. Others may be suffering from severe hypothermia that affects their ability to cooperate with evacuation procedures. Sarah nodded, appreciating Dr. Park's directness. Medical emergencies complicated every aspect of rescue operations, especially when conducted under environmental conditions that challenged the rescuers as well as the victims. What are our medical limitations? Sarah asked. Treatment options are severely constrained by altitude and environmental conditions, Dr. Park replied, her assessment revealing the narrow boundaries between effective medical intervention and futile effort. 4 lines become difficult to establish and maintain. Patient monitoring is complicated by extreme cold and wind. Some medications lose effectiveness at high altitude. The brutal honesty forced Sarah to confront the reality that even successful completion of their mission might not save everyone. They were racing against biological processes that operated according to laws more fundamental than human determination or technical skill. Visual contact with rescue site Alpha, Rodriguez announced, pointing toward a cluster of orange emergency shelters barely visible against the white expanse of glacial ice. Range approximately 5 miles, bearing 270 degrees. Sarah aimed her binoculars toward the coordinates, eventually locating the tiny specks of color that represented human survival in an environment designed to eliminate human life. The shelters appeared impossibly small against the vast scale of the mountain, fragile bubbles of warmth and breathable air surrounded by thousands of vertical feet of frozen death. Ground control reports movement at rescue site Alpha, Dr. Park announced, monitoring communications with relief in her voice. At least some people are still conscious and responding to radio contact. Site Bravo 2.5 miles northeast. Torres called out, having located the second group of stranded personnel through careful map comparison. No visible movement, but emergency shelters appear intact. Sarah felt her chest tighten as she counted the implications. Site Alpha showed signs of life, but Site Bravo's lack of movement could indicate anything from energy conservation to medical emergency to worse possibilities that she refused to consider. Site Charlie, bearing 345 degrees, range 4 miles, Rodriguez added, completing their survey of rescue locations. Shelters visible, but partially buried by snow accumulation. The tactical picture was becoming clear. 3 rescue sites distributed across several miles of terrain that no ground vehicle could traverse, with medical conditions that ranged from serious to potentially fatal. Their single aircraft would need to establish a landing zone that provided access to all 3 sites, then coordinate evacuation procedures for 37 people under environmental conditions that would challenge healthy individuals. Approach planning meeting, Sarah announced, gathering her crew around the navigation charts that would guide their descent into one of the most dangerous landing environments on Earth. I want everyone to understand exactly what we're attempting and what could go wrong. She pointed to the primary landing zone marked on their charts, glacial plateau at 16,800 feet. Surface conditions unknown, but satellite imagery suggests relatively flat terrain with adequate length for aircraft operations. Winds reported as variable, gusting to 60 knots. Rodriguez studied the approach profile, noting elevation changes and terrain features that would affect their flight path. Single approach opportunity. Terrain doesn't allow for go-around procedures. If the first landing attempt fails, Torres consulted her weight and balance calculations, numbers that represented the difference between successful evacuation and aircraft performance that degraded beyond safe limits. Maximum loading will put us at gross weight limits that eliminate normal safety margins. Emergency procedures become unavailable when operating at aircraft performance limits. Kim checked engine monitoring equipment, preparing for operations. That would push mechanical systems toward their design boundaries. Engines will be operating near maximum capability in thin air that reduces power output significantly. Any mechanical problem becomes critical when we have no performance reserves. Dr. Park organized medical equipment for immediate deployment, preparing to treat conditions that might determine whether evacuation efforts succeeded or failed. Patient conditions may have deteriorated beyond our ability to provide effective treatment. We need to be prepared for medical situations that exceed our capabilities. Sarah felt the weight of variables beyond anyone's control, weather systems that could change in minutes, terrain that concealed hazards beneath innocent-looking snow, medical conditions that might have progressed beyond recovery, aircraft performance that approached the limits of what was mechanically possible. Decision point in 15 minutes, she announced, checking her watch against approach charts that marked their commitment to landing. After that, we're committed to completing the mission or becoming additional casualties ourselves. The aircraft continued its approach toward mountains that had claimed hundreds of lives over the decades, carrying a crew that understood they were attempting something at the very edge of possible. Sarah's hands were steady on the controls, but her mind was running through scenarios that ranged from complete success to total disaster, preparing for conditions that would test everything she thought she knew about flying. "Final approach in 10 minutes, Rodriguez announced, his voice calm despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. "Weather holding within marginal limits. Ground control confirms rescue teams are prepared for immediate evacuation." Sarah took a deep breath, tasting the thin air that would soon become their operating environment. 37 people were counting on her ability to land an aircraft on terrain that barely qualified as a landing zone, in weather conditions that pushed beyond the boundaries of safe operations, carrying equipment that would either save lives or prove inadequate for the challenges they faced. The nervous pilot was about to enter the Dragon's lair, the altimeter unwound like a clock counting down to 0 hour as Phoenix 1 descended through increasingly turbulent air toward the glacial plateau that would serve as their landing zone. Sarah's hands moved constantly across the controls, fighting wind gusts that tried to throw the heavy aircraft off course like a toy plane in a hurricane. Ice crystals formed and melted on the windscreen in patterns that shifted with each change in altitude and airspeed. "Passing through 18,000 feet, Rodriguez called out, his voice steady despite the violent shaking that rattled every loose object in the cockpit. Engine performance decreasing as expected. All systems showing normal indications. Sarah felt the aircraft's response becoming increasingly sluggish as the thin air reduced both engine power and control authority. Each control input required more force and produced less result, like trying to swim through water that was slowly turning to molasses. The C-130 was a tough aircraft, but it was being asked to operate beyond the conditions its designers had ever envisioned. "Visual contact with landing zone," Torres announced from her observation post in the cargo bay. "Surface appears solid, but I'm seeing wind patterns that suggest severe turbulence at ground level." Through the windscreen, Sarah could see the plateau they had selected from satellite imagery, a relatively flat expanse of glacial ice surrounded by peaks that rose another 8,000 feet into air too thin to sustain human consciousness without supplemental oxygen. The landing zone looked impossibly small from their current altitude, a tiny patch of questionable terrain surrounded by vertical walls of rock and ice. "Ground wind report," Dr. Park announced, monitoring communications with the rescue teams. "Surface winds gusting to 70 knots, with severe wind shear reported between 17,000 and 16,000 feet. Ground control recommends immediate landing before conditions deteriorate further." Sarah felt sweat forming beneath her oxygen mask despite the bitter cold that penetrated the aircraft's heating system. 70-knot winds represented the upper limit of safe landing operations for any aircraft, but delaying their approach might mean arriving to find conditions that made landing impossible. "Kim, engine status? Power output down 30%. From sea-level performance," the flight engineer replied, monitoring instruments that revealed the harsh reality of high-altitude operations. "Fuel consumption increased significantly. We have adequate reserves for landing and takeoff, but no margin for extended ground operations." The tactical picture was becoming grimly clear. They had one chance to land successfully, extract 37 people under extreme weather conditions, and take off again before fuel reserves reached critical levels. No opportunity for practice approaches, no margin for pilot error, no backup plan if something went wrong. 1,500 feet above ground level, Rodriguez announced, watching the radar altimeter count down their remaining altitude above the glacial surface. "Approach looks stable, but we're starting to feel ground effect from the surrounding peaks." Sarah could feel the aircraft being pushed and pulled by invisible forces as air currents deflected off the mountain walls, created turbulence patterns that changed with each gust of wind. The C-130 bucked and pitched like an angry animal, requiring constant control inputs to maintain anything resembling a stable approach. 1,000 feet at GL, Rodriguez continued, his hands ready to take control if Sarah became overwhelmed by the demands of flying in conditions that pushed beyond normal training scenarios. Surface wind now reported as variable, gusting to 80 knots. Through the windscreen, Sarah could see details of the landing zone that hadn't been visible from higher altitude. The glacial surface was marked by crevasses, wind-carved ridges, and areas where snow accumulation created uncertain footing for an aircraft that weighed over 155,000 pounds when fully loaded. What had appeared smooth and solid from satellite imagery revealed itself as a complex terrain that might or might not support aircraft operations. 500 feet at GL, Rodriguez called out, his voice betraying the first hint of tension as they committed to landing in conditions that allowed no margin for error. Airspeed stable, descent rate controlled, but we're getting hammered by turbulence. Sarah felt the aircraft shudder as it encountered wind shear that changed both speed and direction of the air flowing over the wings. The C-130 dropped suddenly, then climbed just as abruptly, like an elevator operated by someone with no understanding of smooth motion. She fought to maintain control, her training screaming warnings about wind conditions that exceeded safe operating limits, while her determination insisted that 37 lives depended on her ability to land regardless of what the manual said was possible. 200 feet at GL, Rodriguez announced, his voice tight with concentration. Captain, these winds are beyond anything we've trained for. We can still execute a go-around if— Negative, Sarah interrupted, her voice cutting through the engine noise and wind buffeting with surprising steadiness. Those people don't have time for us to wait for better conditions. We're committed. The plateau rushed up to meet them with startling speed as mountain flying compressed distance perception in ways that could fool even experienced pilots. Sarah could see individual rocks protruding through the snow, crevasses that appeared and disappeared as shadows shifted, and most ominously, the orange emergency shelters that marked where human beings were fighting for survival in conditions that existed at the very edge of what life could endure. 50 feet, Rodriguez called, his hand hovering over the controls, ready to take over if Sarah's nerve failed at the critical moment. But her hands remained steady on the yoke, her eyes focused on the rapidly approaching terrain with the intensity of someone who had spent 12 years preparing for exactly this moment. Main gear contact, Rodriguez announced as the aircraft's wheels touched the glacial surface with a jarring impact that sent vibrations through the entire airframe. Braking action. Unknown. Sarah immediately deployed reverse thrust and applied brakes, feeling the aircraft's response to deceleration techniques on a surface that might be solid ice, soft snow, or something in between. The C-130 slowed gradually, its massive weight and momentum carrying it forward across terrain that revealed its characteristics one terrifying second at a time. Ground roll continuing, Rodriguez reported, watching their speed decrease with agonizing slowness. Surface appears solid, but we're getting some lateral movement from wind gusts. The aircraft finally rolled to a stop approximately 2/3 of the way across the plateau, its engines still running to maintain electrical power and cabin heat, in an environment where mechanical failure could prove fatal within minutes. Through the windscreen, Sarah could see the rescue sites scattered across the surrounding terrain, like tiny beacons of human presence in a landscape designed to eliminate human life. Engines remain running, Sarah announced over the aircraft's intercom system. Ground operations commence immediately. Torres, begin passenger loading procedures. Dr. Park, prepare medical equipment for immediate deployment. Rodriguez, monitor aircraft systems and weather conditions. Torres was already moving toward the cargo door, her loadmaster training, taking over as she prepared to supervise operations that would determine whether their mission succeeded or joined the long list of rescue attempts that had ended in additional casualties. Cargo door opening. Ground crew standing by for immediate patient loading. The first blast of outside air that entered the aircraft carried temperatures that registered somewhere around -40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold that penetrated protective clothing and reminded everyone aboard that they were operating in an environment where exposure meant death within minutes rather than hours. But it also carried something else, the sound of human voices calling for help. "First rescue team deploying," Dr. Park announced, leading a group of ground personnel toward the nearest emergency shelter. Medical equipment loaded on emergency sleds. Estimated time for first patient loading, 15 minutes. Sarah maintained her position in the cockpit, monitoring engine parameters and weather conditions, while coordinating the rescue operations that would determine whether their dangerous landing had been worth the risk. Through the side window, she could see figures moving across the glacial surface toward the orange shelters that contained whatever remained of the 37-person expedition. Radio contact with Rescue Site Alpha. Torres reported from her communication station. 18 people conscious and mobile, 6 people requiring medical assistance, 2 people unresponsive. The news hit Sarah like physical impact. They had arrived in time to save most of the trapped expedition, but not everyone. 2 people had lost their battle against the mountain while waiting for rescue that came too late. The weight of that failure settled across her shoulders despite the rational knowledge that they had attempted something most experts considered impossible. Site Bravo responding. Dr. Park's voice crackled over the radio from her position with the ground rescue team. 11 people in various stages of hypothermia and altitude sickness. All conscious, but 3 requiring immediate medical intervention. Moving toward aircraft now. Rodriguez looked up from his weather monitoring station with an expression that suggested complications were developing faster than solutions. "Captain, I'm getting reports of deteriorating conditions from Pakistani Meteorological Service. Wind speeds increasing, visibility decreasing. Weather window is closing faster than predicted." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest as time pressure compressed their operational options. Loading 35 survivors would require at least 30 minutes under ideal conditions, but conditions were far from ideal. Patients suffering from hypothermia and altitude sickness couldn't be moved quickly without risking additional medical complications, but delaying evacuation might trap everyone in weather conditions that would make takeoff impossible. "Site Charlie. Status?" she asked, monitoring the progress of rescue operations that were proceeding with the desperate efficiency of people who understood that minutes might determine who lived and who died. 8 people located, Torres reported, coordinating communications between multiple rescue teams. Severe hypothermia in 3 cases. 1 person with suspected frostbite requiring immediate amputation. Medical condition serious, but transportable. "Doctor." Park's voice joined the conversation from Site Bravo, where she was supervising medical triage under conditions that would challenge emergency room physicians. First group of patients incoming. Hypothermia cases requiring active rewarming. 4 fluids needed for severe dehydration. "Captain, we need maximum cabin heat and minimum flight turbulence for patient care." Sarah nodded grimly, understanding that medical requirements might conflict with flight safety procedures if weather conditions continued deteriorating. Smooth flight characteristics required careful attention to airspeed and altitude control, but emergency departure might necessitate accepting higher levels of turbulence to escape weather conditions that could trap them permanently. Loading. Operations proceeding, Torres announced from the cargo bay, where the first group of survivors was being assisted aboard the aircraft. Patient securing in progress. Medical equipment deployed. Estimated completion time, 25 minutes. Rodriguez looked up from his meteorological displays with an expression that suggested their timeline was being compressed by forces beyond anyone's control. "Captain, wind speeds are now gusting to 90 knots. Surface visibility dropping rapidly due to blowing snow. Pakistani Air Traffic Control is reporting that weather conditions are approaching the point where all aircraft operations will be suspended. The tactical picture was becoming grimly clear. They had perhaps 20 minutes to complete loading operations and execute takeoff before weather conditions eliminated their ability to depart safely. But rushing medical evacuation procedures could result in additional casualties among people they were trying to save. Kin, aircraft status for immediate departure? The flight engineer consulted his monitoring equipment, checking systems that would need to function flawlessly during takeoff operations conducted at maximum gross weight in deteriorating weather conditions. All systems nominal, but fuel consumption during ground operations is higher than calculated due to environmental conditions. We have adequate reserves for takeoff and return flight, but no margin for delays or emergency procedures. Dr. Park's voice crackled over the radio from outside the aircraft, where she was supervising medical care under conditions that tested the limits of field medicine. Captain, I have 3 patients requiring immediate surgical intervention that can't be performed in flight. We need to establish priorities for evacuation based on medical condition rather than convenience. The brutal assessment forced Sarah to confront decisions that no amount of flight training had prepared her for. Medical triage meant choosing who received priority treatment and evacuation, but it also meant accepting that some people might not survive regardless of their efforts. Medical priorities established, she announced, her voice steady despite the weight of decisions that would determine who lived and who died. Critically injured patients receive priority loading. Ambulatory survivors assist with evacuation procedures. Everyone understand their responsibilities. Site Alpha evacuation complete, Torres reported as the first group of survivors settled into the aircraft's passenger compartment, their faces marked by exhaustion and exposure, but alive despite conditions that had claimed hundreds of other lives on the same mountain. 18 people aboard, including 2 requiring continuous medical monitoring. Site Bravo team incoming, Dr. Park announced, leading a group of survivors across terrain that required careful navigation to avoid crevasses concealed beneath wind-blown snow. 11 people, including 3 stretcher cases requiring immediate hospital transport upon arrival. Sarah watched through the cockpit windows as figures moved across the glacial surface toward their aircraft, each person representing a victory against odds that most experts had calculated as impossible to overcome. But the rescue operation was far from complete, and weather conditions continued deteriorating with each passing minute. Site Charlie evacuation in progress, Torres reported, coordinating the complex logistics of loading injured people into an aircraft that was rapidly approaching maximum weight capacity. 8 people, including 1 requiring emergency medical procedures during flight. Rodriguez checked his weather monitoring equipment with increasing concern. Captain, surface. Winds now gusting to 100 knots. Ground visibility less than 1/4 mile due to blowing snow. We're approaching the point where takeoff becomes impossible regardless of aircraft capability. The mathematics of their situation were becoming inexorably clear. They had successfully located and begun evacuating 37 people from conditions that would have killed them within hours, but weather conditions were deteriorating faster than evacuation procedures could be completed. Soon they would face the choice between attempting takeoff in conditions beyond safe limits or remaining on the ground until weather improved, which might not happen for days. Final patient loading, Dr. Park announced, climbing aboard the aircraft. With the last group of survivors, 35 people evacuated successfully. 2 casualties confirmed at Site Alpha: hypothermia and oxygen deprivation. Sarah felt the weight of those 2 lost lives, despite the knowledge that 35 people would return home to families who had feared the worst. Rescue operations were measured in lives saved rather than lives lost, but the human cost of their delayed arrival would remain with her forever. All personnel aboard, Torres reported, securing the cargo bay for takeoff operations that would test both aircraft and crew capabilities under conditions that existed at the very edge of possible. Weight and balance within limits, but we're at maximum gross weight with degraded performance characteristics. Passenger manifest complete, Dr. Park added, beginning medical care for patients whose conditions ranged from exhaustion to life-threatening hypothermia. 3 people requiring continuous monitoring during flight. Medical equipment deployed for emergency procedures. Sarah felt the moment of decision approaching with the inevitability of storm systems that acknowledge no human authority. They could attempt takeoff in weather conditions that exceeded safe operating limits, or they could remain on the ground with 35 survivors and risk becoming additional casualties themselves if conditions continued deteriorating. Kim, aircraft. Ready for immediate departure? The flight engineer completed his final systems check, monitoring instruments that would guide their escape from an environment designed to kill anything that remained exposed for extended periods. All systems green. Engines at normal operating. Parameters. Aircraft configured for maximum performance takeoff. Rodriguez, weather assessment for takeoff? The co-pilot studied meteorological displays that painted a picture of atmospheric conditions, approaching the limits of what aircraft could safely navigate. Wind speed now sustained at 80 knots, gusting to 110. Visibility less than 1/8 mile. Conditions are beyond recommended limits for aircraft operations. Sarah looked through the windscreen at terrain that disappeared into blowing snow and darkness, then back at the passenger compartment where 35 people were depending on her ability to fly them to safety despite weather conditions that would challenge the most experienced pilots in the world. "All hands prepare for immediate takeoff," she announced, advancing the throttles to begin the takeoff roll that would either carry them to safety or add 38 more names to the mountain's casualty list. The Ki-130's engine spooled up to maximum power with a roar that seemed to challenge the mountain winds themselves. 4 turboprop power plants delivering every available ounce of thrust to overcome the combined forces of aircraft weight, altitude limitations, and atmospheric conditions that pushed beyond the boundaries of safe operations. Sarah felt the aircraft strain against its wheel brakes like a racehorse held at the starting gate. 37 lives depending on her ability to make physics work in their favor. "Maximum power achieved," Kim announced, monitoring engine parameters that showed all 4 power plants operating at the very edge of their design capabilities. Engine temperatures approaching redline limits due to thin air and maximum thrust. Requirements. Sarah released the brakes and Phoenix 1 began its takeoff roll across glacial surface that revealed its characteristics through the landing gear's vibrations, transmitted up through the airframe. Ice and packed snow provided uncertain traction for an aircraft that needed every foot of available distance to achieve flying speed in air too thin to provide normal lift characteristics. "Airspeed building," Rodriguez called out, watching instruments that measured their progress toward the minimum speed required for flight. 30 knots, 40, 50, Through the windscreen, Sarah could see the end of their improvised runway approaching with alarming speed as the aircraft struggled to accelerate in atmospheric conditions that reduced both engine performance and aerodynamic efficiency. Plateau that had seemed adequate for landing operations now appeared disturbingly short for takeoff with maximum gross weight. 60 knots, Rodriguez continued, his voice steady despite the mathematical reality that they were approaching the point where successful takeoff transitioned from probable to possible to miraculous. 70 rotation speed approaching. Sarah felt the aircraft's response, becoming increasingly sluggish as thin air reduced the effectiveness of control surfaces designed for sea-level operations. Each control input required more force and produced less result, like trying to fly through atmosphere that was slowly turning to vacuum. "V1 speed," Rodriguez announced, marking the point beyond which stopping the takeoff attempt would carry them off the end of available runway space. They were committed now, regardless of what conditions they encountered during the remaining seconds of ground roll. Rotate, Rodriguez called as the airspeed indicator reached the minimum speed for flight in their current configuration. Sarah pulled back on the yoke, feeling the aircraft struggle to overcome gravity and inertia that seemed magnified by the hostile environment. Phoenix, one lifted from the glacial surface with the reluctant grace of a machine operating beyond its design parameters, climbing slowly through air that provided barely adequate lift for an aircraft, carrying maximum weight at altitude that challenged the fundamental assumptions of flight training. The mountain terrain fell away beneath them with agonizing slowness as they fought for every foot of altitude. Positive rate of climb, Rodriguez confirmed, watching instruments that showed their gradual escape from terrain that had claimed hundreds of lives over the decades. Landing gear retracting. Flaps coming up. Sarah felt the aircraft's performance improve marginally as landing gear and flaps retracted to reduce drag, but their rate of climb remained dangerously low for operations. In mountainous terrain where a single downdraft could drive them back into contact with unforgiving rock and ice. Terrain warning, Kim announced as automated systems detected their proximity to mountain peaks that rose on all sides like the walls of a frozen prison. Minimum safe altitude for terrain clearance requires climbing to 22,000 feet. The mathematics were becoming grimly clear. They needed to climb 5,000 feet to achieve safe terrain clearance, but their current rate of climb suggested that would require nearly 20 minutes of sustained ascent through atmospheric conditions that could change from marginal to impossible without warning. Severe turbulence ahead, Rodriguez reported, noting weather radar returns that showed atmospheric disturbances extending across their planned flight path. Multiple layers of wind shear between our current altitude and minimum safe altitude. Dr. Park's voice joined the conversation from the passenger compartment, where she was providing medical care under conditions that challenged every aspect of field medicine. Captain, I have 3 patients in critical condition requiring smooth flight characteristics for medical procedures. Severe turbulence could prove fatal for people already weakened by hypothermia and altitude exposure. Sarah felt the familiar weight of decisions that balanced competing requirements for safety, mission accomplishment, and patient care. Avoiding turbulence required altitude and route changes that might exceed aircraft performance capabilities, but accepting turbulence could prove fatal for passengers whose medical condition left no margin for additional stress. Torres, passenger status? The loadmaster's voice carried the controlled tension of someone managing 35 survivors under conditions that tested every aspect of crew coordination. Passengers secured as well as possible given medical conditions. 3 stretcher cases requiring continuous monitoring. Several people experiencing motion sickness from altitude and stress. Kim looked up from his engine monitoring station with an expression that suggested mechanical systems were approaching their operational limits. Captain, we're asking these engines to produce maximum power in conditions they weren't designed for. Engine temperatures are approaching the point where we'll need to reduce power to prevent damage. The tactical situation was becoming increasingly constrained by forces beyond anyone's control. They needed maximum power to climb through terrain that offered no margin for reduced performance, but maintaining maximum power might result in engine failure that would prove catastrophic at their current altitude and position. Fuel status? Sarah asked, knowing that every minute of climb operations consumed precious reserves that would be needed for the long flight back to civilization. Rodriguez consulted fuel quantity indicators that showed consumption rates elevated by the demands of high-altitude operations at maximum gross weight. Fuel remaining adequate for return flight, but no reserves for extended climbing or emergency procedures. We need to reach cruising altitude quickly to reduce consumption rates. Sarah felt the aircraft encounter the first edge of the turbulence that weather radar had detected. A sudden buffeting that rattled loose equipment and reminded everyone aboard that they were flying through atmospheric conditions that existed at the very edge of what aircraft could safely navigate. "Medical emergency in the passenger compartment," Dr. Park announced, her voice carrying the controlled urgency of someone dealing with life-threatening conditions under impossible circumstances. "Severe hypothermia case experiencing cardiac irregularities. Need immediate descent to lower altitude for medical treatment." The request struck Sarah like physical impact. Descent to lower altitude would provide thicker air and reduced environmental stress for medical patients, but it would also carry them closer to terrain that offered no margin for error in navigation or aircraft control. They were trapped between medical necessity and flight safety requirements that appeared to offer no acceptable compromise. "Can the patient survive continued climb to safe altitude?" Sarah asked, understanding that medical reality might override flight safety considerations. "Uncertain," Dr. Park replied with brutal honesty. "Cardiac stress from altitude and hypothermia could prove fatal during extended exposure to thin air. But descent into turbulent air, low altitude, could be equally dangerous." Rodriguez looked up from his navigation instruments with news that compressed their decision timeline even further. "Captain, Pakistani Air Traffic Control is reporting severe weather moving into our departure route. If we don't reach cruising altitude within the next 10 minutes, we may be trapped by storm systems that eliminate our ability to return to lower elevation." Sarah felt the convergence of factors beyond anyone's control. Medical emergencies that required immediate response, weather conditions that were deteriorating by the minute, aircraft performance that approached the limits of what was mechanically possible, and terrain that offered no margin for pilot error or equipment failure. Continuing climb to safe altitude, she decided, her voice steady despite the weight of decisions that could determine whether they all returned home safely or joined the mountain's casualty list. "Dr. Park, do everything possible to stabilize the patient during climb operations. Torres, secure all loose equipment for severe turbulence. Everyone prepare for conditions that will test our limits." The aircraft climbed slowly through increasingly violent air that tossed the heavy C-130 like a toy plane in a hurricane. Ice formed and melted on the windscreen in patterns that shifted with each change in altitude and atmospheric conditions, while turbulence rattled every structural component, with forces that tested the aircraft's design margins. "Passing through 20,000 feet, Rodriguez announced, monitoring their gradual progress toward altitude that would provide safe terrain clearance. Severe turbulence continuing. Engine performance holding within acceptable limits." Dr. Park's voice carried strain as she provided medical care under conditions that would challenge hospital emergency rooms. "Patient condition stabilizing. Cardiac rhythm improving with supplemental oxygen and active rewarming. Continuing medical monitoring." Sarah felt the aircraft break through the worst of the turbulence as they climbed above the altitude where mountain-generated wind shear created the most violent atmospheric disturbances. The ride became marginally smoother, though they were still operating in conditions that pushed both aircraft and crew beyond normal training scenarios. 22,000 feet achieved, Rodriguez confirmed, his voice carrying relief as automated terrain. Warning systems finally indicated safe clearance from the mountain peaks that had surrounded them like frozen guardians. Minimum safe altitude reached. Beginning cruise climb to more efficient altitude. Torres looked up from her passenger monitoring station with news that marked their transition from rescue operations to evacuation flight. All passengers secured. For cruise flight, medical conditions stable. No additional emergencies reported. Kim checked his engine monitoring equipment, confirming that mechanical systems had survived the demands of maximum performance operations at altitude that tested every component's design capabilities. engine parameters returning to normal ranges, fuel consumption decreasing as we reach more efficient cruise altitude. Sarah felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease as Phoenix 1 climbed away from the mountains that had claimed so many lives over the decades. They had successfully extracted 35 people from conditions that most experts had declared unsurvivable, proving that careful preparation and coordinated execution could overcome odds that appeared impossible. Navigation update, Rodriguez announced, beginning the long process of route management that would carry them back to civilization. Flight time to Turkey approximately 4 hours. Weather conditions along our route appear favorable for normal operations. Dr. Park's voice joined the conversation from the passenger compartment, where she continued providing medical care for people whose survival represented victory against some of the most hostile conditions on Earth. Medical update, all patients stable for continued flight. 3 cases requiring hospital treatment upon arrival, but no immediate life-threatening conditions. Sarah looked back through the cockpit at the passenger compartment, where 35 people were wrapped in emergency blankets and breathing supplemental oxygen, while slowly recovering from an ordeal that would mark them for the rest of their lives. Each face represented a life saved, a family that would be reunited, a victory against odds that had seemed insurmountable. Torres, passenger manifest for medical priority at destination. The loadmaster consulted her records, coordinating information that would ensure proper medical care for people whose conditions ranged from exhaustion to serious hypothermia. 3 priority medical cases requiring immediate hospital transport. 8 people needing evaluation for frostbite and altitude-related complications. Remaining passengers require observation but appear stable. Rodriguez checked his navigation instruments, confirming their progress along a route that would carry them away from the mountain environment, where they had spent the most dangerous hours of their careers. Estimated arrival in Turkey in 3 hours 45 minutes. Medical facilities have been alerted and are standing by for patient transport. Kim looked up from his engine monitoring station with satisfaction that marked successful completion of operations that had pushed both aircraft and crew beyond everything they had trained for. All systems operating normally. Fuel reserves adequate for normal cruise flight, plus required reserves. Sarah felt the weight of command responsibility beginning to ease as Phoenix 1 carried them away from the Karakoram Mountains toward the relative safety of established flight routes and normal operational procedures. But she knew that the mission's success would be measured not just in lives saved, but in the demonstration that careful preparation could overcome challenges that appeared impossible. Mission success, she announced over the aircraft's intercom system, her voice carrying to 35 survivors who owed their lives to a crew that had refused to accept that some rescues were beyond the boundaries of possible. All passengers aboard, all crew members safe, aircraft performing normally. Estimated arrival at medical facilities in less than 4 hours. The announcement was met with subdued cheers from the passenger compartment, the sound of people who had faced death and survived through a combination of their own endurance and the determination of rescuers who had refused to abandon them to the mountains in different hostility. As the aircraft continued its flight toward Turkey, Sarah reflected on the mission that had tested everything she thought she knew about flying, leadership, and the limits of human capability. They had proven that nervous energy could be channeled into meticulous preparation, that careful planning could overcome impossible odds, and that sometimes the pilot who worried about everything was exactly what a mission required. 4 hours later, Phoenix 1 touched down at Incirlik Air Base in Turkey with the gentle precision of a routine training flight. Its landing so smooth that several passengers barely noticed the transition from flight to ground operations. But Sarah knew that the apparent normalcy concealed the extraordinary nature of what they had accomplished. 35 people extracted from conditions that had been calculated as unsurvivable, proving that human determination could overcome odds that existed at the very edge of possible. "Excellent landing, Captain," Rodriguez observed as they taxied toward the medical facility where ambulances and hospital personnel were standing by to provide care for passengers whose conditions ranged from exhaustion to serious hypothermia. "Hard to believe we were flying through mountain winds 4 hours ago." Sarah felt the weight of successful mission completion settling across her shoulders like a familiar but lighter jacket. They had attempted something that most experts had declared impossible, succeeded despite conditions that pushed beyond the boundaries of safe operations, and proven that careful preparation could triumph over challenges that appeared insurmountable. "Medical teams standing by," Dr. Park announced from the passenger compartment, where she continued monitoring patients whose recovery would be measured in days and weeks rather than hours. 3 people requiring immediate hospital transport, 8 needing medical evaluation, remaining passengers cleared for routine processing. Torres opened the cargo door to admit Turkish medical personnel who moved with the efficient urgency of professionals accustomed to handling emergency situations. Stretchers appeared for the most seriously injured passengers, while ambulatory survivors were assisted toward transportation that would carry them to medical facilities equipped for treating conditions related to extreme cold and altitude exposure. "Aircraft secure," Kim announced, completing shutdown procedures for engines that had performed flawlessly under conditions that tested every mechanical system beyond normal design parameters. "All systems nominal, no discrepancies requiring immediate maintenance attention." Sarah remained in the cockpit, watching through the windows as passengers were transferred to medical care that would complete the healing process begun during their extraction from the mountain environment. Each person represented a life saved, a family that would be reunited, a victory against natural forces that acknowledge no authority beyond the laws of physics. "Captain Chun," a voice called from the cargo bay as Colonel Harrison climbed aboard the aircraft, her expression carrying a combination of relief and something that might have been respect. "I've been monitoring your mission from Germany. Preliminary reports suggest you accomplished something that most people considered impossible." Sarah stood to face her commanding officer, feeling the mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction that marked successful completion of operations that pushed beyond normal boundaries. 35 people extracted successfully, Colonel. 2 casualties confirmed before our arrival. Mission accomplished within acceptable parameters. Harrison nodded slowly, her expression revealing appreciation for the careful language that acknowledged both success and loss. The International Mountain Rescue Organization is calling this the most successful high-altitude extraction in their history. Pakistani authorities are recommending your crew for international recognition. The crew performed exceptionally, Sarah replied, deflecting individual recognition toward the team effort that had made success possible. Rodriguez, Torres, Kim, and Dr. Park each contributed expertise that was essential for mission success. Individual recognition would be inappropriate. Dr. Park emerged from the passenger compartment, her medical bag lighter, but her expression marked by the satisfaction of providing care under conditions that had challenged every aspect of field medicine. Final medical report, Colonel. All evacuated personnel are expected to make complete recovery. 3 cases requiring extended hospital treatment, but no permanent injuries anticipated. Torres completed her final passenger manifest, documenting the successful extraction that would be studied by rescue organizations around the world as an example of what became possible when preparation met opportunity under extreme conditions. 35 people transported successfully. Weight and balance maintained within acceptable limits throughout all phases of operation. Kim finished his post-flight inspection, confirming that aircraft systems had survived the demands of operations. That pushed mechanical capabilities beyond normal design parameters. Aircraft performed excellently throughout mission. No maintenance issues requiring immediate attention. Ready for return flight to Germany. Colonel Harrison looked at each crew member in turn, her expression carrying the kind of recognition that came from understanding exactly what they had accomplished. You've proven that careful preparation and coordinated execution can overcome challenges that appear impossible. This mission will be studied and remembered long after all of us have retired. Rodriguez consulted his watch, noting that normal operational schedules seemed almost trivial after spending hours flying through conditions that existed at the very edge of survivable. Crew rest requirements met. Aircraft ready for departure. Estimated flight time to Germany approximately 6 hours. Sarah felt the familiar routine of flight planning beginning to reassert itself as they prepared for the journey that would carry them back to the normal world of routine operations and standard procedures. But she knew that the mission they had just completed would mark a turning point in how she understood the relationship between nervousness and competence. Departure in 1 hour, she announced, beginning the pre-flight preparations that would carry them home to Germany. Standard flight operations, normal weather conditions, routine navigation. After what we've just accomplished, everything else should seem easy. As Phoenix 1 lifted off from Turkish soil and climbed toward cruising altitude, Sarah reflected on the mission that had tested everything she thought she knew about flying, leadership, and the limits of human capability. They had proven that nervous energy could be channeled into meticulous preparation, that careful planning could overcome impossible odds, and that sometimes the pilot who worried about everything was exactly what a mission required. The flight back to Germany passed without incident. 6 hours of routine operations that felt almost anticlimactic after the intensity of mountain flying in conditions that had pushed both aircraft and crew beyond everything they had trained for. But Sarah knew that the apparent normalcy was itself a victory. They had attempted something extraordinary and returned to normal operations with everyone safe. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in the briefing room at Ramstein Air Base, facing an audience of military officials, rescue organization representatives, and media personnel who had gathered to hear the official account of the mission that was already being called the most successful high-altitude rescue in aviation history. Charts and photographs covered the walls, documenting conditions that most experts had calculated as unsurvivable. The success of this mission, she began, reading from prepared remarks that somehow failed to capture the reality of flying through mountain winds, while 37 lives hung in the balance, resulted from careful preparation, coordinated team execution, and the determination to attempt what others considered impossible. In the front row, Rodriguez, Torres, Kim, and Dr. Park sat with expressions that reflected their shared understanding of what they had accomplished together. Each wore decorations that recognized their individual contributions to a mission that had required every specialty to function perfectly under extreme conditions. The aircraft modifications proved essential, Sarah continued, noting technical factors that had enabled their success. Specialized oxygen systems, high-altitude medical equipment, and enhanced navigation capabilities provided the tools necessary for operations in an environment that challenged every assumption about normal flight operations. General Patricia Murphy, commanding officer of United States Air Forces in Europe, stood to address the audience with remarks that carried the weight of institutional recognition. Captain Chun and her crew have demonstrated that American military aviation can accomplish missions that push beyond the boundaries of what most people consider possible. Their success saves lives and enhances our nation's reputation for humanitarian assistance. Sarah felt the familiar discomfort of individual recognition for achievements that had required team effort to accomplish. But she also understood that public recognition served purposes beyond personal acknowledgement. It demonstrated the capability of careful preparation to overcome challenges that appeared insurmountable. Questions from the media, General Murphy announced, opening the floor to reporters who had traveled from around the world to document a story that combined human drama with technical achievement. Captain Chun, a reporter from Aviation Week, began. Your colleagues have described you as a pilot who checks everything twice and plans for every contingency. How did that approach contribute to mission success? Sarah considered her response carefully, understanding that her answer would be quoted in publications that reached aviation professionals around the world. Nervousness and competence aren't mutually exclusive. Being nervous means considering every variable, planning for every contingency, and refusing to assume that luck will compensate for inadequate preparation. In this case, nervous energy channeled into meticulous planning proved exactly what the mission required. Dr. Park, another reporter continued, you treated patients under conditions that would challenge hospital emergency rooms. How did you manage medical care at 25,000 feet in a turbulent aircraft? Dr. Park's response reflected the practical reality of field medicine under extreme conditions. Medical care in that environment required adaptation rather than ideal procedures. The key was rapid evacuation to proper facilities, rather than attempting complex treatment under impossible conditions. Sometimes the best medicine is simply getting people to where proper medical care is available. A reporter from the International Mountain Rescue Organization asked Torres about the logistics of extracting 35 people under maximum weight conditions. The loading calculations were complex, Torres replied, but the real challenge was coordinating medical requirements with aircraft limitations. Success required constant communication between medical personnel and flight crew to balance patient care with flight safety. Kim fielded questions about aircraft performance at extreme altitude and maximum gross weight. The C-130 is designed for demanding operations, but this mission pushed beyond normal parameters. Engine performance decreases significantly in thin air, control response becomes sluggish, and emergency procedures become limited when operating at aircraft limits. Success required understanding and planning for degraded performance rather than optimal conditions. The aircraft climbed steadily toward cruising altitude, carrying a crew that understood the value of thorough preparation and the importance of never assuming that confidence could substitute for competence. Behind them, the story of their mountain rescue continued to inspire pilots, rescue workers, and anyone who had ever been told that their careful approach to challenging situations was a sign of weakness rather than strength. In the end, the nervous pilot had discovered that being nervous wasn't something to overcome it was something to embrace, channel, and transform into the kind of meticulous preparation that made extraordinary achievements possible when ordinary methods weren't enough. The flight continued through peaceful skies, routine operations that carried the potential for extraordinary challenges, guided by a pilot who had learned that worrying about everything could be the foundation for accomplishing anything. What an incredible adventure we've shared together. We followed Captain Sarah Chun from her early struggles with self-doubt through one of the most harrowing rescue missions ever attempted, watching her transform from the nervous pilot into a leader whose meticulous preparation saved 35 lives in impossible conditions. If this story captivated you, moved you, or made you think differently about the relationship between anxiety and achievement, I'd be incredibly grateful if you would. Hit the like button to show your support for these detailed, novel-length stories. Subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest epic narratives. Share this story with friends, family, or anyone who would appreciate a tale of triumph against impossible odds.